I call Gareth Hughes.
Happy to take the call on this bill tonight, which is mostly common sense. But what I want to talk about is a couple of loves of mine. Firstly, rugby, and then the Rugby World Cup. Because in less than 500 days, the World Cup kicks off, and this is going to be the biggest event for New Zealand ever to host, but also a good opportunity of infrastructure opportunities lost, and a good chance where we could have taken advantage, leveraged our natural assets, and actually built our prosperity. It's a big deal because the Cup's part of the government's 5 infrastructure priorities. So what I want to do is touch on the bill a little bit, talk about housing, and then lastly finish off with the Rugby World Cup. So on this bill, the Greens voted for it in the first and the second readings because on the whole it's mostly common sense. We support it and we're glad the Minister has split the bill up into 4 parts because as I said in my second reading speech, one of these parts of the bill wasn't like the other, and that was the housing affordability section. So we're glad that Part 4 now has become the Affordable Housing Enabling Territorial Authorities Act repeal bill, and tonight we'll be opposing that bill. Part 1, now the Utilities Access Bill, creates a framework through a consistent national code for access by utility operators to transport corridors. Part 2, it harmonises the notice provisions across all the acts and requires territorial local authorities to pay for any amenity improvements when utilities are moved or upgraded. And Part 3, common sense, cleans up the Railways Corporation Act and harmonises its management provisions with other state-owned enterprises legislation. But it's Part 4 I want to touch on briefly, the part which repeals the Affordable Housing Enabling Territorials Act. We voted for this act in this House originally, and I'm glad to say we'll be opposing its repeal tonight. The Greens support the retention of clauses prohibiting restrictive covenants that aim to exclude social housing. However, we're disappointed that the government has decided to water down these provisions and to remove the prohibition of restricted covenants that aim to exclude affordable housing. As Moana Maki says, it's a right to discriminate as long as you say you're not discriminating. Housing affordability is a major issue in New Zealand, with close to 1 in 3 New Zealanders spending 30% or more of their disposable income on housing. Russell Norman, a few years back in this House in 2007, here he is, said there's a number of fundamental factors driving the housing affordability crisis in this country, amongst which are foreign buyers, perverse tax laws, poor planning for Auckland's growth, lack of supply of cheaper housing to rent and buy. But it seems this government's main initiative in this area is slashing the state housing budget, growing the state house waiting list and selling state houses. This government has failed to take decisive action and introduce a capital gains tax not on the family home to help make housing more affordable. This government is repealing this act but isn't proposing anything to help with the housing affordability crisis. Members will be aware, as well as being concerned about housing affordability, the Greens are also concerned about our appalling cold, damp rental properties in New Zealand. Of the 1.5 million homes in New Zealand, more than 460,000 are rentals. These are generally the coldest, the least efficient of our housing stock. Our rentals are cold, they're old, they're uninsulated, they're damp and they're mouldy, and they're expensive to rent. They're expensive to heat, with more than a quarter of Kiwis spending more than 10% of their weekly income on heating. And at the moment, its tenants, be it students or grandparents or the poor, they're suffering the heating costs, the housing costs, and the costs in general of our substandard housing. When we look at one of our biggest natural assets, our homes, we must act. We've got to get them up to a minimum, warm, healthy standard. In my second reading speech on this bill, I looked at the folly of kicking to touch $10.7 billion of our nation's wealth on the roads of national significance. But tonight I want to look at another of the infrastructure priorities for this government, the Rugby World Cup. I mean, imagine what it's going to be like. We've got an estimated 60 to 85,000 visitors expected to fly to New Zealand for the Cup. They're going to arrive at Auckland Airport to look for the train, but there isn't going to be one. They're going to have to pile onto Auckland's notoriously crowded motorways in a minivan or taxi and experience what congestion's like. Hopping off downtown Auckland, they'll find there's no inner-city rail loop. They'll discover all of our transport systems are heavily car-reliant, with hardly any public transport in the towns and none in the smaller centres. They'll figure out pretty fast this government's infrastructure priorities, noticing all the roadworks going on, and before we heard Labour and National comparing who's spending more on roads and motorways, they'll find new roads and motorways being built in Auckland and Wellington, and they'll ask about the trains, but all they'll find is one tiny train line still serves the whole of Auckland, and it still, in 2011, runs on dirty old diesel power. They'll arrive in New Zealand to find that we're undergoing the fastest rate of native vegetation loss since colonial times. They'll find our rivers are unswimmable, and we're considering converting dirty old lignite coal to fertiliser thanks to rampant dairy expansion, and our greenhouse gases are more than 25% above our 1990 levels. Whether visitors stay in a hotel, motel or rented holiday home, they'll be likely to be confronted, like our renters, with cold, damp accommodation. They'll find the house is probably uninsulated, there's no such thing as double glazing, and only a few solar hot water heaters are around. The light bulbs will be mostly the old-fashioned, wasteful, incandescent ones that the government phased out of. Across the country, they'll find every day 780 people missing a game of rugby, missing a day of school or a day of work as a result of being sick from their housing, or they'll find 50 people a day in hospital sick as a result of our housing. They'll feel stunned and cheated by the marketing slogan when they find the expectation of clean and green New Zealand is shattered, and this is going to have big ramifications for our economy. The World Cup could show up New Zealand as an international environmental embarrassment to an increasingly environmentally conscious global public. However, the World Cup could show New Zealanders the urgency for a raft of cost-effective, job-producing, green infrastructure investments. Looking to the past, we could have risen to the challenge and electrified Auckland's rail network in time for the Cup. We could have started the CBD rail loop in Auckland, and we could have started the process to get a rail line to the Auckland airport. We could have invested in our transport infrastructure to get around faster, more comfortably, with less oil, more options and more jobs for Kiwis. We could have marketed ourselves with 100% green electricity production and other low-carbon solutions, not just hollow ambitions like the New Zealand Energy Strategy. We could have had a green stadium at Mount Eden, which would have made a great World Cup legacy. With less than 500 days to go to the Cup, we've missed the boat. We've missed the chance to invest wisely in sustainable, future-proof infrastructure. Looking to the future, we need to make sure the ball isn't dropped on our clean green brand. Overfishing, dirty dairying, GE animals, damming the last of the wild rivers all move New Zealand closer to a clean green brand sin bin. This is especially important considering it's already on the agenda of the likes of The Economist, The New York Times and The Guardian. Mr. Speaker, the worst outcome, waking up the day after the Cup, would be a mess to clean up and nothing to show for the party. Kia ora.